The crack of the whip echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Texas, silencing the crowd that had gathered to witness justice or what passed for it in 1875. 20-year-old Theresa Walsh stifled her cries as the leather bit into her back for the third time, her thin cotton dress offering little protection against the punishment for a loaf of bread she'd stolen to feed herself and her ailing father. Blood trickled down her spine as she gripped the wooden post they'd tied her to, the late afternoon sun beating down mercilessly on her exposed neck. 6 lashes was her sentence, a harsh but standard punishment for theft in this unforgiving frontier town. 4. Shouted the bailiff as the whip cracked again. Theresa bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to give the leering crowd the satisfaction of hearing her scream. Her vision blurred, dark spots dancing before her eyes as she fought to remain conscious. Hold. A deep voice cut through the haze of her pain. That's enough. Through tear-filled eyes, Theresa saw a tall figure pushing through the crowd. The afternoon sun silhouetted him, casting his face in shadow, but she could make out the unmistakable outline of a cowboy hat and broad shoulders. "This ain't your business, stranger," the bailiff said, preparing to deliver the 5th lash. "I'm making it my business." The stranger's voice was calm but left no room for argument. He approached the small platform where Justice Hiram Porter presided over the punishment. "What's the debt for the bread she stole?" the stranger asked, reaching into his pocket. Justice Porter adjusted his spectacles. $2 for the bread plus $3 for court costs. The stranger pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out 5 silver dollars, placing them in the justice's outstretched hand. "I've settled her debt. Release her." The sentence was 6 lashes, Porter protested weakly, clearly surprised by the intervention. "She's had 4. That's more than enough for a loaf of bread. The debt's paid. Let her go." Something in the stranger's stance, perhaps the way his hand rested near the revolver on his hip, convinced the justice not to argue further. He nodded to the bailiff, who reluctantly lowered his whip. As they untied her hands, Theresa's legs buckled beneath her. Before she could collapse to the wooden platform, strong arms caught her, lifting her with surprising gentleness. "I've got you," the stranger murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Now that he was close, Theresa could see his face weathered from the sun and wind, with kind eyes that belied his hard exterior. He looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair peeking out from beneath his hat and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "Why?" she whispered, too weak to say more. The stranger didn't answer as he carried her through the dispersing crowd, their curious gazes following them down the dusty main street. "Name's Hugh Blackwood," he finally said as they reached the town doctor's small office. "And I don't stand by watching innocent women suffer." Dr. Frederick Morgan was tending to a young boy with a broken arm when Hugh kicked open the door, Theresa still cradled in his arms. "Good God," the doctor exclaimed, taking in Theresa's bloodied back. "Put her on the examination table face down, gently now." Hugh laid her down with careful hands. "She needs tending, Doc. She took 4 lashes. Dr. Morgan frowned, dismissing the boy and his mother with instructions to return the next day. "For what crime?" "Stealing bread," Hugh replied, his jaw tightening. The doctor shook his head in disgust as he gathered supplies. "This town gets more barbaric by the day. Porter's punishments have been getting increasingly severe." Hugh moved to leave, but Theresa's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Please." Something in her gaze kept him rooted to the spot. He nodded, pulling up a chair beside the examination table while the doctor cut away the back of her dress to examine her wounds. "These will need cleaning and stitching," Dr. Morgan said. "It's going to hurt, miss." "Theresa," she said through gritted teeth. "My name is Theresa Walsh." "Miss Walsh, I need to clean these wounds. Mr. Blackwood, if you'd be so kind as to hold her hand, this won't be pleasant." Hugh took her small hand in his calloused one, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Squeeze as hard as you need to," he told her. As the doctor applied alcohol to the lash marks, Theresa's back arched in pain, a strangled cry escaping her lips. Her grip on Hugh's hand tightened until her knuckles turned white, but he didn't flinch. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Just fine." For the next half hour, as the doctor cleaned and stitched her wounds, Hugh distracted her with tales of his travels through the territories, describing the snow-capped mountains of Colorado and the vast open plains of Kansas. His deep voice washed over her, giving her something to focus on besides the searing pain. When Dr. Morgan finally finished, Theresa was pale and covered in sweat, but conscious. "She'll need rest," the doctor said, washing his hands in a basin. "Those wounds must be kept clean to prevent infection. She shouldn't be moved far." "I have a room at the Westward Hotel," Hugh said. "She can recover there." "No," Theresa protested weakly. "My father, he's ill. I need to get back to him." Hugh and the doctor exchanged glances. "Where does your father live, Miss Walsh?" Dr. Morgan asked. "Small cabin, east edge of town," she replied. "He has consumption. I've been caring for him since my mother died last winter." Understanding dawned on Hugh's face. The bread hadn't been for her alone. "I'll take her home," Hugh decided. "And I'll fetch whatever supplies she needs." Dr. Morgan nodded, preparing a small packet of powders. "For the pain," he explained, handing it to Hugh. "Mix with water, and here's a salve for the wounds. They'll need redressing tomorrow. I can call on her." "Thank you, doctor," Theresa whispered. "No need for thanks, just rest and heal." The doctor hesitated, then added, "And consider yourself fortunate that Mr. Blackwood happened to be passing through our town today." Hugh helped Theresa sit up, draped his coat around her shoulders to preserve her modesty, and lifted her once more. She was light in his arms, too light, suggesting she'd been going without proper food for some time. Outside, the streets had emptied as townspeople returned to their business. The afternoon was waning, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Hugh carried Theresa toward the eastern edge of town, following her murmured directions. "Why did you help me?" she asked again as they neared a small, weather-beaten cabin set back from the road. Hugh was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "My sister died in a town not unlike this one. She stole medicine for her child. No one stepped in to help her." The simple explanation, delivered without embellishment, told Theresa more about this man than a lengthy speech could have. She rested her head against his shoulder, too exhausted to reply. The cabin, when they reached it, was neat but desperately poor. Hugh nudged the door open with his foot and carried her inside. An older man lay on a narrow bed in the corner, his breathing labored. "Theresa," he called weakly. "Is that you, child?" "It's me, Pa," she answered. "I've brought help." Hugh gently laid her on the second bed, little more than a straw-filled mattress on a simple frame, before approaching the sick man. "Sir, I'm Hugh Blackwood," he introduced himself. "Your daughter's been hurt. I'm here to help if I may." Patrick Walsh's roomy eyes assessed the stranger in his home, taking in the gun on his hip and the quiet confidence in his stance. "What happened to my girl?" he demanded, his voice stronger than his frail appearance suggested. Hugh glanced at Theresa, unsure how much to reveal. She gave him a slight nod. "She was caught taking bread from Finch's bakery," Hugh explained. "The justice ordered her flogged. I stopped it after 4 lashes and paid her debt." Patrick Walsh's face crumpled. "Oh, Theresa. You shouldn't have risked yourself for me." "We needed to eat, Pa," she said simply. Hugh watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened. "I'll fetch supplies, food, medicine, clean bandages. Is there anything specific you need?" "We couldn't accept charity," Patrick began, but Hugh cut him off. "It's not charity, sir. It's—" He paused, then made a decision that would alter the course of 3 lives. "It's what a man does for his wife's family." Both Theresa and her father stared at him in confusion. "I've offered Miss Walsh my name," Hugh continued, his eyes finding Theresa's. "A marriage of convenience to protect her from further harm in this town. Once she accepts, I'll have the right and responsibility to care for both of you." "I've only just met you," Theresa said, bewildered. "Yes," Hugh acknowledged. "And you have no reason to trust me, but I give you my word as a man that I'll treat you with respect and provide for you and your father. When he's well enough to travel, we can head west to California, where the air is better for consumptives." Patrick Walsh studied the tall cowboy. "And what do you get from this arrangement, Mr. Blackwood?" Hugh met the older man's gaze steadily. Companionship, someone to cook meals and keep a home when I settle down. I've been riding solo too long. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Theresa, her father asked, this must be your decision. She looked at Hugh, this stranger who had saved her from public humiliation and possibly death, who now offered security when they had none. He wasn't asking for love, just an arrangement beneficial to both parties, and he was willing to care for her ailing father. I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood, she said quietly, though I think we should know more about each other before we wed. A ghost of a smile touched Hugh's lips. Fair enough, we'll take a few days for that. For now, let me fetch those supplies. As Hugh left the cabin, Theresa exchanged a look with her father. Do you think I'm making a mistake, Pa? Patrick Walsh coughed weakly. I think that man has ghosts, Theresa, but I also think he has honor. That's rare enough in these parts. When Hugh returned an hour later, his arms were laden with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, bacon, beans, and potatoes. He'd also brought a bottle of cough syrup for Patrick, clean bandages for Theresa's wounds, and most surprising of all, a small bouquet of wildflowers. Thought these might brighten the place, he said awkwardly, placing them in a chipped cup with water. For the first time that day, Theresa smiled. It transformed her face, lighting her green eyes and revealing a dimple in her right cheek. Hugh found himself staring, momentarily transfixed. He cleared his throat and busied himself storing the supplies. I've spoken to the pastor, he said as he worked. He can perform a simple ceremony tomorrow if you're still willing. Theresa nodded, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. I am. Hugh glanced at her father, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. I should let you rest, he said. I'll return in the morning, Mr. Blackwood, Theresa called as he reached the door. Thank you for everything. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then slipped out into the gathering darkness. True to his word, Hugh returned the next morning, accompanied by Dr. Morgan, who checked Theresa's wounds and pronounced them healing well. No sign of infection, the doctor said, applying fresh salve, but you must continue to rest. No strenuous activity for at least a week. Hugh, who had been examining the cabin's leaky roof while the doctor tended to Theresa, spoke up. She'll have time to heal. I've taken a room at the hotel where we can stay until she's strong enough to travel. And her father, Dr. Morgan asked. He'll come with us, of course. The hotel has a ground floor room with 2 beds that will suit them both until we can arrange more permanent accommodations. Theresa, who was sitting up for the first time since her ordeal, looked at Hugh with surprise. You've thought of everything, he shrugged. Just practical matters. After the doctor left, Hugh helped Patrick into a chair while Theresa changed into her only other dress behind a makeshift screen. The simple blue cotton garment was faded but clean, and she'd managed to brush her chestnut hair into a semblance of order. When she emerged, Hugh was momentarily struck silent. Even pale and moving gingerly, she was beautiful not in the flashy way of saloon girls, but with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength. The pastor is waiting at the church, he said, offering her his arm. It's not far. Patrick Walsh insisted on walking to the church himself, leaning heavily on a cane. The small party made their way slowly through town, drawing curious glances from the citizens of Redemption Creek. Word had spread about the cowboy who had intervened in the flogging and paid the thief's debt. The church was a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Pastor William Ellis, a kind-faced man in his 50s, greeted them at the door. Mr. Blackwood explained your circumstances, he told Theresa quietly. I want you to know that this house of God is always open to you, regardless of what Justice Porter might say. Theresa blinked back tears at this unexpected kindness. Thank you, Pastor. The ceremony was brief and simple. Hugh had procured a plain gold band from the general store, surprisingly thoughtful. Theresa noted, as many frontier marriages were performed without such niceties. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Hugh lifted her hand and placed a gentle kiss on her knuckles. It was a courtly gesture that spoke of a upbringing at odds with his rough exterior. After signing the marriage certificate, they made their way to the Westward Hotel, where the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Abigail Jenkins, had prepared the promised ground floor room for Theresa and her father. "I've had hot water brought up for washing," Mrs. Jenkins said, showing them in, "and there's stew keeping warm for your dinner." "Thank you," Hugh said, pressing a coin into her hand. "My wife will need regular meals and quiet rest." The word wife sounded strange to Theresa's ears. Just yesterday, she had been a desperate young woman facing public punishment. Today, she was Mrs. Hugh Blackwood, with a roof over her head and food for her father. As Mrs. Jenkins departed, Hugh turned to Theresa. "I've taken a room upstairs," he said. "I thought you'd be more comfortable with your father, at least until he's stronger." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you for understanding," Hugh nodded. "I meant what I said, Theresa. This is a marriage of convenience. I won't make demands that you're unwilling to meet." Patrick Walsh, who had been settling into one of the beds, spoke up. "You're a decent man, Blackwood, but perhaps you two should speak privately for a moment." Hugh offered his arm to Theresa once more, and they stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the hotel's garden. "I know we've done things backwards," Hugh said, leaning against the railing. "Meeting, marrying, and only now getting acquainted, but I want you to know something about me." Theresa waited, studying his profile as he gazed out at the setting sun. "I was married before," he continued. "Her name was Sarah. She died 3 years ago along with our unborn child when outlaws raided our ranch in the New Mexico territory." "I'm so sorry," Theresa whispered. Hugh's hands tightened on the railing. "I tracked those men for a year, found them one by one, made them pay." The simple statement sent a chill down Theresa's spine. This was the darkness she had glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior. "Since then, I've been drifting," he said, "taking odd jobs, mostly as a ranch hand or occasionally as a guide for settlers. I was on my way to California when I stopped here." "Why did you really help me?" Theresa asked, sensing there was more to his story than he'd revealed. Hugh turned to face her, his expression solemn. "Because when I saw you tied to that post, taking that punishment without breaking, I recognized something. The same kind of strength Sarah had, and I couldn't stand by and watch another good woman suffer when I had the means to help." The honesty in his voice touched something in Theresa. "I don't expect you to love me," she said, "but I promise to be a good wife to you, Hugh Blackwood." He took her hand, his touch gentle. "And I promise to be a good husband to you, Theresa Blackwood, to protect you and provide for you, and to treat you with the respect you deserve." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a solid foundation for a marriage of convenience, one that might, in time, grow into something more. As they stood together on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Theresa felt a cautious hope bloom in her heart. Perhaps this unexpected marriage would be the second chance they both needed. The next morning, Hugh rode out of town, explaining that he needed to retrieve his belongings from a camp several miles away. "I won't be gone more than a few hours," he assured Theresa as he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder. "Mrs. Jenkins will look in on you and your father." Theresa nodded, still adjusting to the gold band on her finger and the new reality of her life. "We'll be fine." Hugh hesitated, then leaned down from his saddle and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Rest, wife," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth that hadn't been there before. As he rode away, Theresa felt eyes on her. Turning, she saw Justice Porter watching from across the street, his expression dark with disapproval. She lifted her chin and met his gaze steadily before returning inside. Mrs. Jenkins proved to be a godsend, bringing hot meals and fresh linens, and sitting with Patrick while Theresa rested. By mid-afternoon, Theresa was feeling strong enough to sit in a chair by the window, reading one of the books Mrs. Jenkins had loaned her. A commotion in the street drew her attention. Hugh had returned, but he wasn't alone. Behind his horse trotted a small wagon pulled by a sturdy mule. In the wagon bed were several trunks, a saddle, what looked like cooking equipment, and other supplies. Theresa made her way to the door, curious. Hugh was directing 2 young men from the livery to unload the wagon and bring his belongings to the hotel. "What's all this?" she asked as he approached. "Our things," he replied. "Everything I own, which isn't much," and he reached into the wagon and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Something for you. Puzzled, Theresa unwrapped the package to find a beautiful dark green dress made of sturdy but fine wool. Hugh, I can't accept, you can and you will, he said firmly. My wife shouldn't have just one dress to her name. The simple statement, delivered without fuss, brought tears to Theresa's eyes. No one had given her a gift since her mother died. Thank you, she said, running her fingers over the soft material. Hugh looked uncomfortable with her emotion. It's practical. The nights get cold, even in summer when we travel. Theresa smiled, already learning to see through his gruff exterior. Of course, very practical. That evening, they shared their first proper meal as a family in the hotel's small dining room. Patrick, who had rallied somewhat with proper food and medicine, was able to join them at the table. So, son-in-law, Patrick said as they ate, what are your plans for my daughter and me? Hugh set down his fork. As I mentioned, I think California would be best for your health, sir. The dry air in the southern part of the state has helped many consumptives. I have enough saved to buy a small parcel of land, perhaps start a horse breeding operation. You know horses? Theresa asked. Hugh nodded. Worked with them most of my life. My father raised quarter horses in Kentucky before the war. This new piece of information that Hugh came from the East and had knowledge of breeding bloodstock added another layer to Theresa's understanding of her new husband. When would we leave? She asked. Not until you're fully healed and your father is strong enough for the journey, Hugh replied. Perhaps 2 weeks. That will give me time to purchase supplies and a proper wagon. Patrick coughed, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. When he pulled it away, Theresa saw specks of blood. Her heart sank. His condition wasn't improving as she'd hoped. Hugh noticed too. His eyes met Theresa's and a silent understanding passed between them. They needed to reach California sooner rather than later. I'll speak to Dr. Morgan tomorrow, Hugh said quietly. See if there's anything more we can do to ease the journey for your father. Later that night, after Patrick had fallen asleep, Theresa joined Hugh on the balcony once more. The night was clear, stars spread like diamonds across the velvet sky. He's getting worse, isn't he? Hugh asked, his voice low. Theresa nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The consumption comes and goes, good days and bad, but yes, I think the disease is progressing. Hugh hesitated, then put an arm around her shoulders. I'm sorry, Theresa. She leaned into his strength, grateful for the comfort. He's been ill for almost a year. The doctor in St. Louis said he might have 6 months. That was 8 months ago. He's fighting to stay with you, Hugh observed. Yes, Theresa sighed. But now that we're married, I think he might let go. He's been holding on because he was worried about leaving me alone. Hugh tightened his arm around her. He doesn't need to worry about that anymore. Theresa looked up at him, studying his face in the moonlight. No, he doesn't. You're a good man, Hugh Blackwood, better than I expected when you carried me from that flogging post. A faint smile touched his lips. Don't go spreading that around. I've cultivated a reputation as a hard case. The joke, unexpected from this serious man, startled a laugh from her. The sound seemed to please him, his eyes warming as he gazed down at her. For a moment, something shifted between them, a current of awareness that transcended their practical arrangement. Theresa felt her heart quicken as Hugh's gaze dropped to her lips. But then he stepped back, releasing her. You should rest, he said, his voice rough. Tomorrow will be another long day. Theresa nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that fluttered in her chest. Good night, Hugh. Good night, Theresa. As she slipped back into the room she shared with her father, Theresa acknowledged a surprising truth. She was beginning to care for this quiet, honorable man who had saved her from disgrace and offered her a future. Whether Hugh could ever return, those feelings remained to be seen. The next week passed in a flurry of preparations. Hugh purchased a sturdy covered wagon and a team of mules, filling it with supplies for the long journey to California. Dr. Morgan provided medicines for Patrick and removed Theresa's stitches, pronouncing her healed enough for travel. The scars will fade with time, he told her, but you must continue to be careful until the new skin toughens. Hugh had taken to sleeping on a pallet outside Theresa and Patrick's room, ostensibly to guard them, but also, Theresa suspected, to maintain a proper distance between them. Despite their marriage, he continued to treat her with courtly respect, never pushing for more than she offered. In turn, Theresa found herself drawn to her husband's quiet strength and unfailing kindness. She learned that he enjoyed poetry, having discovered a well-worn volume of Tennyson in his saddlebag. That he took his coffee black, but had a weakness for apple pie. That he could sit for hours in companionable silence, content to whittle a piece of wood while she read or tended to her father. On the night before their planned departure, Patrick's condition worsened suddenly. His breathing became labored and a high fever set in, leaving him delirious. "Pa, can you hear me?" Theresa asked, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. Patrick's eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused. "Margaret," he called, using Theresa's mother's name. "Is that you, my love?" Tears welled in Theresa's eyes. "It's Theresa, Pa, Mother's not here." Hugh, who had been packing the last of their belongings, moved to her side. "I'll fetch the doctor by the time doctor." Morgan arrived. Patrick's breathing had become a desperate rattle. The doctor examined him with a grave expression. "I'm sorry," he told them quietly. "The disease has spread. His lungs are filling with fluid. It's only a matter of hours now." Theresa sank into a chair beside her father's bed, taking his hand in hers. "Can't we do anything?" Dr. Morgan shook his head. "Make him comfortable. That's all any of us can do at this point." Hugh thanked the doctor and saw him out, then returned to Theresa's side. Without a word, he pulled a chair up beside hers and sat, his solid presence a comfort in the face of impending loss. Throughout the long night, as Patrick's breathing grew more labored, Hugh remained at Theresa's side. Sometimes he held her hand, other times he simply sat in silent support. When she wept, he offered his handkerchief without comment. Near dawn, Patrick rallied briefly, his eyes clearing as he looked at his daughter. "Theresa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My brave girl." "I'm here, Pa," she said, squeezing his hand. Patrick's gaze shifted to Hugh. "Take care of her," he managed. Hugh met the dying man's eyes. "I will, sir, you have my word." A ghost of a smile touched Patrick's lips. "I know." His eyes drifted closed. "I'll tell your mother you're in good hands." Those were his last words. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Patrick Walsh drew his final breath, his hand going slack in his daughter's grip. Theresa made no sound as her father slipped away, but tears streamed down her face. Hugh put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his chest as she wept silently for the last of her family. They buried Patrick Walsh the next day in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek. Pastor Ellis conducted a simple service, attended by Dr. Morgan, Mrs. Jenkins, and a few others who had come to know the small family during their brief stay. As the final prayers were said, Hugh stood beside Theresa, his hat in his hands, his face solemn. When she swayed slightly on her feet, exhausted from grief and a sleepless night, he steadied her with a gentle hand at her waist. "We can delay our departure," he told her as they walked back to the hotel. "Take time for you to grieve." Theresa shook her head. "No, there's nothing for me here now. Pa wanted us to go to California. I want to honor that wish." Hugh studied her face, noting the determination beneath the sorrow. "Very well, we'll leave tomorrow as planned." That night, for the first time, Theresa invited Hugh to stay in her room. Not for intimacy, she was still too raw with grief for that, but because she couldn't bear to be alone with her thoughts. Hugh made his pallet on the floor without comment, respecting her need for both company and space. In the darkness, Theresa found comfort in the sound of his steady breathing. "Hugh," she whispered after a long silence. "Yes, thank you, for everything." There was a pause, then his quiet reply, "Try to sleep, Theresa. Tomorrow we begin a new chapter." They left Redemption Creek at first light, the wagon loaded with their few possessions and supplies for the journey. Hugh had sold or given away anything that wasn't essential, keeping only what they would need for the long trip west. Theresa sat beside him on the wagon seat, wearing the green dress he had given her and a sturdy bonnet to protect her from the sun. As they passed the town limits, she didn't look back. "How long will it take to reach California?" she asked as the town disappeared behind them. 2 months if the weather holds and we don't encounter any serious trouble," Hugh replied, handling the team with practiced ease. We'll follow the southern route through New Mexico territory and Arizona. It's safer than the northern passes, especially as winter approaches. Theresa nodded, watching the landscape unfold before them, rolling hills giving way to open prairie. Have you traveled this way before? Yes, several times, first as a scout for wagon trains, later on my own. Hugh glanced at her. It won't be an easy journey, Theresa. The trail is hard and there are dangers, heat, lack of water, hostile tribes in some areas. I'm not afraid, she said, lifting her chin. I'm stronger than I look. A faint smile touched his lips. I know that, I've seen it. The first week on the trail tested Theresa's resolve. The days were long and hot, the wagon's motion relentless as they covered 20 miles each day. At night, they camped beside streams or watering holes, Hugh teaching her how to set up camp efficiently and safely. Despite her grief and physical discomfort, Theresa found herself adapting to trail life with surprising quickness. She learned to cook over an open fire, to spot landmarks that indicated water sources, and to handle the team when Hugh needed to hunt for fresh meat. More importantly, she began to know her husband not just as the man who had saved her from the flogging post, but as a complex individual with his own strengths and vulnerabilities. She discovered that Hugh was a skilled hunter and tracker, able to read the land like a book. That he spoke passable Spanish and a few words of various native languages. That he suffered from occasional nightmares that left him restless and haunted-eyed at dawn. On those mornings, Theresa would quietly prepare coffee, strong and black the way he liked it, and sit with him as the sun rose, offering silent companionship until the shadows receded from his gaze. 10 days into their journey, they encountered their first significant challenge. A sudden thunderstorm swept across the prairie, turning the trail to mud and forcing them to seek shelter beneath an outcropping of rocks. Rain lashed against the canvas cover of their wagon as they huddled inside, listening to the thunder rumble overhead. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the interior of their makeshift home. "Will the wagon hold?" Theresa asked, eyeing the canvas as water began to seep through in places. Hugh nodded, wringing out a blanket that had gotten wet. "It's seen worse. The real concern is the trail. If it's washed out, we'll have to find another route." A particularly loud crack of thunder made Theresa jump. Without thinking, she moved closer to Hugh, seeking comfort in his presence. He stiffened slightly, then relaxed, putting his arm around her shoulders. "It's just noise," he said softly. "Nothing to fear." "I know," she replied, but didn't move away. "I've never liked storms. My mother used to say they were just the angels rearranging furniture in heaven." Hugh chuckled, the sound reverberating through his chest. "I haven't heard that one before." Theresa looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were, his arm around her, her side pressed against his. In the dim light of their lantern, his features were softened, the habitual guardedness in his eyes replaced by something warmer. "Hugh," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "Yes." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then another crash of thunder broke the spell, and Hugh withdrew his hand. "We should try to get some sleep," he said, his voice rough. "Storm or no, we need to make progress tomorrow." Theresa nodded, disappointed but understanding. They were still finding their way with each other, still navigating the boundaries of their unconventional marriage. As she settled into her bedroll, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. 2 weeks ago, she had been a desperate young woman caring for her dying father, stealing bread to survive. Now she was a widow traveling west with a husband she barely knew but was coming to respect and, perhaps, to care for more deeply than she had anticipated. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world and a trail that was muddy but passable. They continued west, crossing into New Mexico territory, where the landscape changed dramatically, red rock formations rising from the desert floor, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the harsh environment. They passed through small settlements and trading posts, restocking supplies and gathering information about trail conditions ahead. Hugh was known in some of these places, greeted with respect by traders and local ranchers. How is it that so many people know you?" Theresa asked one evening as they camped outside a small settlement called Cedar Springs. Hugh stoked the fire, his expression thoughtful. "I told you I tracked the men who killed Sarah. That took me through most of these territories. I made connections, some friends, some just acquaintances who found me useful." "Useful how?" He hesitated. "I have a certain reputation for finding people who don't want to be found, for handling problems that local law can't or won't address." Theresa considered this. "You were a bounty hunter." "Sometimes. Other times I worked for ranchers tracking rustlers or for the army as a scout." Hugh met her gaze across the fire. "I've never been an outlaw, Theresa, but I've walked the edge of the law when necessary." She nodded slowly. "I understand why you might not have mentioned this before." "Do you?" He watched her carefully. "Most women would be disturbed to learn they'd married a man with my history." Theresa thought of the gentle way he tended to her wounds, the respect he showed her, the patience with which he taught her the skills she needed on the trail. "I'm not most women," she said simply. "And I judge a man by his actions toward me, not his past." Something in Hugh's expression softened. "No, you're not most women. That's becoming increasingly clear." The next day, they encountered a group of travelers heading east, a family returning to Missouri after failing to establish a homestead in Arizona territory. "The land's too harsh," the father told Hugh as they shared coffee beside the trail. "Not enough water for crops, too many raiders taking what little we managed to grow." Hugh nodded sympathetically. "The southern territories aren't easy country. You heading to California?" the man asked, eyeing their wagon. "Yes," Hugh replied, "southern route through Arizona." The man glanced at Theresa, who was speaking with his wife and children nearby. "Watch yourselves through a patchy country. There's been trouble lately, renegade bands attacking isolated travelers." Hugh's expression remained impassive, but Theresa, who was beginning to read him well, noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. "We'll be careful," he assured the man. As they continued their journey that afternoon, Theresa broached the subject. "The Apache, are they really a danger to us?" Hugh didn't sugarcoat his answer. "They can be. Most tribes leave peaceful travelers alone, but there are always renegade bands who have lost family to the army or settlers and seek revenge on any white face they encounter." "What can we do?" "Stay alert. Avoid camping in obvious places." "Keep moving." Hugh glanced at her. "And I'll teach you to shoot, starting today." That evening, Hugh set up targets, tin cans on a fallen log, and showed Theresa how to handle his spare revolver, a Colt .45. "It has a kick," he warned, standing behind her to adjust her stance. "Brace yourself." The first shot sent Theresa stumbling backward, the gun's recoil stronger than she'd expected. Hugh steadied her, his hands firm on her shoulders. "Again," he instructed. "This time, lean into it. The gun is part of you, not separate." For an hour they practiced, Hugh's patience never wavering as Theresa gradually improved her aim and control. By the time darkness fell, she could hit the target more often than not. "Not bad for a first lesson," Hugh said, a note of approval in his voice that made Theresa unreasonably pleased. As they prepared for sleep that night, Hugh cleaned both revolvers meticulously before loading them and placing one beside each of their bedrolls. "Just in case," he said, catching Theresa's questioning look, "though I hope you never need to use it." They crossed into Arizona territory 3 days later, the landscape becoming increasingly rugged and beautiful, vast canyons carved by ancient rivers, mesas rising like sentinels against the azure sky. The heat was intense during the day, the nights surprisingly cold as autumn progressed. Hugh grew more vigilant, scanning the horizon frequently and choosing their campsites with greater care. He insisted they travel in the open where possible, avoiding narrow canyons and passes where an ambush would be easy. Despite the increased tension, Theresa found herself mesmerized by the wild beauty of the territory. Each morning brought new vistas, each evening new colors as the setting sun painted the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful," she said one evening as they watched the sunset from their camp on a small rise. "Harsh, but beautiful," Hugh nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. That's the West for you, beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. Like you, Theresa said without thinking. Hugh turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. Me, Theresa flushed, embarrassed by her impulsive comment. I only meant you have a hard exterior, but there's beauty in your actions, in your kindness and honor. For a long moment, Hugh simply looked at her, something shifting in his gaze. Then he reached out, taking her hand in his calloused one. Theresa, he began, his voice low and rough with emotion. But whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the distant sound of horses, multiple riders approaching their camp at speed. Hugh was on his feet instantly, drawing his revolver. "Get to the wagon," he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice. "Take the rifle and stay down." Theresa obeyed, her heart pounding as she retrieved the Winchester rifle from its place in the wagon. Through a gap in the canvas, she watched as Hugh positioned himself between the approaching riders and their camp, his stance relaxed but ready. The riders, 6 men on dusty horses, came into view, slowing as they approached. They weren't Apache, as Theresa had feared, but white men with the hard look of those who lived by violence. "Evening," the leader called, a tall man with a scar running down one cheek. "Mind if we share your fire?" "I'd prefer you didn't," Hugh replied calmly. "We're turning in early, long day tomorrow." The leader's eyes narrowed. "That's not very neighborly." Wasn't trying to be neighborly, just honest. The tension in the air was palpable as the 2 men assessed each other. Theresa tightened her grip on the rifle, remembering Hugh's instructions on how to aim and fire. "You traveling alone?" the scarred man asked, his gaze shifting to the wagon. "No," Hugh replied, "with my wife." One of the other men snickered. "Maybe she'd like some company besides yours." Hugh's expression didn't change, but something deadly entered his eyes. "I suggest you move on, now." The leader studied Hugh for a long moment, taking in the confident way he held his weapon, the set of his shoulders, the unwavering gaze. Something he saw made him reconsider. "Come on, boys," he finally said. "This fire ain't worth the trouble." As the riders moved away, continuing north, Theresa released the breath she'd been holding. Hugh remained vigilant until the men were out of sight, then returned to the wagon. Who were they? She asked, still clutching the rifle. "Trouble," Hugh replied simply. "Probably outlaws heading for the border, but they're gone now." That night, Hugh insisted they take turns keeping watch. Theresa took the first shift, sitting beside the banked fire with the rifle across her knees, jumping at every sound in the darkness. When Hugh relieved her at midnight, she was exhausted but too keyed up to sleep immediately. "Will you sit with me for a while?" she asked, not ready to be alone with her thoughts. Hugh nodded, making room for her beside him on the log he'd pulled up as a seat. They sat in silence. The vastness of the desert night spread around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "I was afraid," Theresa admitted after a time, "not just of those men, but of what might happen to you if there was trouble." Hugh glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You were worried about me." "Of course I was." She met his gaze steadily. "You've become important to me, Hugh." He looked away, staring into the glowing embers of the fire. "This isn't the life I would have chosen for you, Theresa, always watching over your shoulder, never knowing what danger might be around the next bend." "It's still better than the life I had before you found me," she replied softly. "And I'm not as fragile as you seem to think." Hugh turned back to her, his expression serious. "I know you're strong. I've seen it every day since we met, but that doesn't mean I want to see you tested by the harshness of this life." "That's not your decision to make," Theresa pointed out. "I chose to marry you, Hugh. I chose this journey." "Did you?" he asked quietly. "Or did circumstances force your hand?" Theresa considered the question, recognizing the genuine concern behind it. "Perhaps circumstances brought us together," she acknowledged. "But every day since then has been my choice, including this moment right now." With that, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Hugh remained still for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he deepened the kiss. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, his embrace protective without being possessive. When they finally parted, both breathing a little faster, Hugh rested his forehead against hers. "Theresa," he murmured, her name a caress on his lips. She smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spread through her. "I should let you keep watch," she said reluctantly. Hugh nodded but kept hold of her hand as she stood. "We'll talk tomorrow," he promised, his eyes holding hers, "about what this means, about what you want." "What we both want," she corrected gently, squeezing his hand before releasing it. As she settled into her bedroll, Theresa reflected on how much had changed since that first desperate day in Redemption Creek. She had lost her father, but found a man who treated her with respect and tenderness, who had proven his worth through actions rather than words. A man she was beginning to love. The next morning, there was a new awareness between them, a subtle shift in the way they moved around each other, in the lingering glances and casual touches that had once been rare but now seemed natural. They broke camp early, Hugh anxious to put more distance between themselves and the riders they'd encountered. As they traveled, he pointed out landmarks and taught Theresa to read the signs of water and game, building on the skills she'd already learned. "There," he said, indicating a distant smudge of green against the red landscape. "That's our destination for today, a spring with good water and shelter." They reached the spring by mid-afternoon, a small oasis of cottonwood trees and flowing water in the midst of the desert. Hugh checked the area carefully before allowing Theresa to approach the water. "No recent signs of other travelers," he reported. "We should be safe here for the night." As Theresa filled their water barrels, Hugh unsaddled the horses and tended to their needs. The domestic routine they had established over the weeks felt different now, charged with unspoken possibilities. After a simple dinner of rabbit stew Hugh had shot the game that morning, they sat side by side watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. "It's been almost a month since we left Redemption Creek," Theresa observed. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." Hugh nodded, his shoulder warm against hers. "A lot has changed." Theresa turned to look at him, studying his profile in the fading light. "Including us." Hugh met her gaze, his eyes serious. "Yes, including us." He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "I need to know what you want, Theresa, from this journey, from our marriage." She considered her answer carefully, wanting him to understand the depth of her feelings. "When we married, I thought it was just an arrangement, your protection in exchange for my companionship, a practical solution to both our problems." Hugh nodded, waiting for her to continue. "But it's become more than that for me," she admitted. "I've come to care for you, Hugh. Not just as my protector or provider, but as a good man with a good heart despite the hardships you've endured." Something vulnerable flickered in Hugh's expression. "I didn't expect to feel this way again," he said quietly. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of me was gone for good." "And now?" Theresa asked, her heart beating faster. Hugh lifted his free hand to her face, his touch gentle as he traced the curve of her cheek. "Now I find myself thinking about the future again, about building something lasting with you." The simple declaration, delivered without flowery phrases or grand promises, meant more to Theresa than any poetic speech could have. This was Hugh, honest, direct, and true to his word. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." When he kissed her this time, there was a new certainty in his touch, a promise of shared tomorrows that made Theresa's heart soar. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they held each other close, no longer strangers bound by circumstance but partners by choice. That night, for the first time, they shared a bedroll, Hugh's arms around Theresa as they slept beneath the vast canopy of stars. It wasn't just physical intimacy they shared, though that was sweet and tender beyond Theresa's imaginings, but a deeper connection, the joining of two souls who had found in each other an unexpected home. As they continued their journey west in the days that followed, the landscape gradually changed, the stark beauty of the Arizona desert giving way to more varied terrain as they approached the California border. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, the nights cooler. Their relationship deepened as well, each day bringing new discoveries about one another. Theresa learned that Hugh had been educated at a boarding school in the East before the war disrupted his family's fortunes. That he had a surprising talent for sketching, capturing the landscapes they passed in a small notebook he kept in his saddlebag. That when he laughed, a rare but increasingly frequent occurrence, the sound transformed his face, erasing years of hardship and grief. In turn, Hugh discovered Theresa's quick mind and natural aptitude for languages. She picked up Spanish phrases from their occasional encounters with Mexican traders with remarkable speed. He admired her resilience, her willingness to learn the skills needed for frontier life, and her quiet compassion for those they met along the way. 6 weeks after leaving Redemption Creek, they crossed into California territory, the landscape changing dramatically as they descended from the eastern mountains into more fertile valleys. "It's beautiful," Theresa breathed, taking in the rolling hills dotted with oak trees, the distant shimmer of what Hugh told her was the Pacific Ocean. Like the Garden of Eden, Hugh smiled at her wonder. "Wait until you see the southern valleys. Orange groves, vineyards, year-round growing seasons. It's why I chose this destination." "How much farther?" "Another week, perhaps less if the weather holds. I know a place near San Diego, a small valley with good water and fertile soil. Isolated enough for privacy, but close enough to town for supplies and society when we want it." Theresa squeezed his hand. "It sounds perfect." Their progress through California was easier than the earlier parts of their journey. The trails were better maintained, the settlements more frequent. They encountered other travelers, farmers, merchants, families heading to new homesteads, and for the first time in weeks, Theresa didn't feel the constant tension of potential danger. Hugh relaxed somewhat as well, though his vigilant nature remained. He began to speak more freely about his plans for their future, the house he would build, the horses he would breed, the garden he envisioned for Theresa. "I want to give you a good life," he told her one evening as they camped beside a clear stream, "a peaceful one after all you've been through." Theresa leaned against him, content in the circle of his arms. "You already have, Hugh, but I'm looking forward to building that life together." 7 weeks and 3 days after leaving Redemption Creek, they crested a final hill and Hugh reined in the team, pointing to a small valley below them. "There," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "That's it." Theresa followed his gaze, taking in the verdant valley cradled between gentle hills. A stream meandered through it, its banks lined with willows and cottonwoods. The afternoon sun bathed the scene in golden light, making it look like something from a painting. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Is it really ours?" Hugh nodded. "I purchased the land rights before heading east last spring, 160 acres with water rights to the stream." They made their way down the slope, the wagon creaking as Hugh navigated the uneven terrain. As they neared the valley floor, Theresa spotted a simple structure, a cabin of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. "You didn't mention there was already a house," she said, surprised. Hugh looked slightly embarrassed. "I built it last year before heading east, just a basic shelter, nothing fancy. I thought I'd be returning alone, so it's small. We can expand it now." The simple statement that he had built this place with only himself in mind, never expecting to return with a wife, touched Theresa deeply. This cabin represented Hugh's solitary past. What they would build together would be their shared future. As they pulled up before the cabin, Theresa noticed signs that others had been there recently. The path was clear of weeds. The small corral beside the cabin was in good repair. "Has someone been taking care of the place?" she asked. Hugh nodded as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "My friend Miguel from the nearby rancho checks on it occasionally. I sent word ahead when we left Redemption Creek that I was returning with a wife." The word still gave Theresa a small thrill. Wife. She was Hugh Blackwood's wife, and this beautiful valley was to be their home. Hugh came around to help her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. But instead of setting her on the ground, he surprised her by swinging her into his arms. "What are you doing?" she laughed, her arms going around his neck. "Carrying my wife across the threshold," he replied with a rare grin. "Isn't that the tradition?" He carried her to the cabin door, which he pushed open with his foot, revealing a simple but clean interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the room, and a curtained alcove presumably concealed the sleeping area. Most surprising were the fresh flowers in a pottery vase on the table and the fire already burning in the hearth. "Miguel's wife, Elena," Hugh explained, seeing her surprise. "She must have been here today, preparing for our arrival." As he set Theresa gently on her feet, she was overcome with emotion. After weeks on the trail, after all the hardships and dangers they had faced, they had reached their destination, not just a physical place, but a new beginning. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Hugh said softly, his arms still around her. Theresa looked up at him. This man who had saved her from disgrace and offered her his name, who had protected her on the long journey west, who had gradually opened his heart to her as she had opened hers to him. "I love you, Hugh Blackwood," she said, the words she had been holding in her heart finally finding voice. His eyes darkened with emotion as he cupped her face in his hands. "And I love you, Theresa Blackwood, more than I ever thought possible." Their kiss was a promise, a sealing of the bond that had grown between them through hardship and joy, danger and peace. As the setting sun cast golden light through the cabin's small windows, they held each other close. No longer a cowboy who had paid a debt and a woman who had been flogged for stealing bread, but partners in the truest sense, equals in love and life, ready to face whatever the future might bring together. In the years that followed, the small cabin grew into a proper ranch house, with wide verandas and enough rooms for the children that eventually blessed their union first twins, a boy and girl named Patrick and Margaret after Theresa's parents, and later a second son they called James, after Hugh's father. The valley flourished under their care. The horse breeding operation Hugh established, gaining a reputation for quality stock throughout Southern California. Theresa planted gardens, vegetables, to feed their growing family, and flowers because they brought her joy, and established a small orchard of orange and apple trees. They never forgot their beginning, how a chance encounter at a flogging post had brought them together. But what had started as a marriage of convenience had grown into something neither of them had expected to find again. A deep and abiding love that only strengthened with each passing year. On the 10th anniversary of their arrival in the valley, Hugh presented Theresa with a gift, a small wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with intricate patterns of intertwining vines and flowers. "Open it," he urged as they sat together on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Theresa opened it, she found a tiny sketch Hugh had made of the two of them, standing before the original cabin on that first day. "To remind us of how far we've come," Hugh said, his voice rough with emotion, "and that the best journeys often begin in unexpected places." As he fastened the locket around her neck, Theresa covered his hand with hers. "I wouldn't change a single step of our journey," she told him. "Not even the painful ones. They all led us here, to this life we've built together." Hugh drew her into his arms, his kiss as tender as the first they had shared beside a campfire in the Arizona desert. "Nor would I," he murmured against her lips. "Not a single step." As their children's laughter echoed from the garden and the setting sun bathed their home in golden light, Theresa and Hugh Blackwood held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had transformed both their lives. From the depths of despair on a dusty street in Redemption Creek to the heights of happiness in their California valley, they had traveled far, not just in miles, but in heart and spirit. Their story, which had begun with pain and sacrifice, had blossomed into one of enduring love, proving that sometimes the greatest journeys start with a single act of kindness, and the bravest beginnings often come from the most desperate circumstances.